Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out today to Flyleaf Books, your local independent bookstore. And thank you for anyone who's gotten a book while you're here. Your book purchases and attendance at these events help us keep having them, and we really appreciate it. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from Sophie Lewis as she presents Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Policewomen, and Girl Bosses Against Liberation with Tania Rispoli. Sophie Lewis is an ex-academic feminist living in Philadelphia with several of her kin, including Barnacle the cat. Besides Enemy Feminisms, Sophie's published books include Abolish the Family and Full Surrogacy Now, both of which have been translated into many languages. Tania Rispoli is a postdoctoral associate for the NEH Collaborative Grant, The Value of Care at Duke University. All right, thank you. Glad you're here. And thank you. Remember, you can grab a copy of Enemy Feminisms at the front after the reading if you haven't already, and I'm sure that Sophie would be happy to sign after.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. And thank you, Tania, very much for doing this with me. I'm going to read very briefly from the book, and I know that Tania has a lot of really good questions. And then we can all talk about the book together, or rather perhaps talk about anti-fascism, which is the only thing it really feels like we should talk about in this moment. Luckily, this is actually a book about anti-fascism. Feminists committed racist mistakes and their feminisms reflected errors of judgment. This much, at last, we've been dragged kicking and screaming to recognize. But the culture still shows reluctance to contemplate the extent of some feminism's deeper theoretic intertwinements with fascism. What we need now is a bestiary of enemy feminisms to jolt us into understanding that a woman's cry for women's power is sometimes part and parcel of the oppressor's program. Even as we suffer loss in the short term, we can ultimately only gain as feminists when we accept that certain beloved old lines and lineages of feminism weren't just incidentally misogynist, but substantively so, that their core definitions were bourgeois irremediably, that their racism was non-excisable. What are our other options? Shall we attempt the bonkers task of calling in people with opposite aims to our own, decolonizing what is squarely a form of colonialism? Or shall we break up the house of feminism, that battered and beloved fortress where so many of us have not lived well, and dare to name some feminisms enemies, contra the aggrieved cries from certain quarters that it can only ever be patriarchy that benefits when feminists criticize other feminists. I affirm with Gloria Anzaldúa that lines of affinity, not identity, must be drawn. Some feminisms are obstacles to gender freedom, and asking which side are you on is the most elemental level of political physics. The side of women doesn't exist. It never existed. So let's be brave and swallow our bitter medicine. Feminists across the political spectrum have taken pains to define their troops as chaste and untainted by lust, especially interracial lust, not to mention maternal, i.e. pure, straight, removed from the realm of productive work, and quote-unquote natural, that is, not artificial, not femme, neither surgically nor chemically enhanced. Black feminisms have a better track record, but of course some black feminists too have been thoroughly ableist in this way, or whorephobic, or anti-communist. All in all, a great deal of feminisms have imagined their central subject as hardworking, non-disabled, healthful, and prosthesis-free, these being the unspoken complements to a womanhood that is life-giving, or at least pro-family, economically independent, or at least aspiring, non-violent, or at least law-abiding, and quote-unquote self-respecting, not a body modifier or a bottom. All of this was feminism, not liberatory feminism, but feminism, in the sense that it contested a patriarchal constraint placed upon a certain group of women, no matter how few. Victorious Aristo-feminists proceeded to co-engineer and enforce patriarchal or eugenic constraints for others. They even expected generalized feminist support for their accessions. Is this worse than a hypothetical gentleman-only alternative domination? No, but nor is such equal opportunity inequality, such counter-revolutionary fairness, remotely what my team is fighting for. We need to be discerning about any given feminism precisely because feminism is so capacious that it comprises within itself its own mortal enemies. I say this as a reluctant feminist killjoy because I belong to feminism. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here to present this timely and very well-written book alongside our author. Sophie Lewis is a writer, theorist, and teacher who has been instrumental in rethinking and rewriting feminist theory toward visions of care, intersectional struggles, and communal trans-feminist futures. She comes from a German and British background and earned her PhD at the University of Manchester, writing a dissertation titled Cyborg Labor Exploring Surrogacy as Gestational Work, where she reframed the political economy of contract pregnancy through anti-work, polymaternalism, and utopian lens. Currently, she is based in Philadelphia, and she works as an independent scholar and teaches feminist theory at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. So I have to begin this presentation with an admission. I arrived at feminism late. And this is in contrast to Sophie, who traces an early feminist consciousness back to her childhood in this book. Like Sophie, I come from a mixed family, Italian and Serbian, and my first encounter was with social movements that mobilized against the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001, as well as against the transnational institutions of capitalist governance like the G8. For me, grassroots activism was always intersectional, a messy convergence of different struggles. The Italian feminists I encountered then, many of whom were still anchored to radical feminism emphasis on sexual difference as a political category, seemed a really strange group to me. My transition to feminism happened between 2014 and 2016 when the rising feminicides against women and trans people in Italy led us to form Non Una di Meno, inspired by the Argentinian movement Ni Una Menos. From its inception, and despite internal debates, Non Una di Meno defined itself as a trans-feminist movement, one that rejected the biological essentialism of gender and instead embraced its multiplicity. It understood gender as a construction shaped by material conditions inseparable from struggles against nationalism, capitalism, and borders. This meant, in a practical sense, among other things, forging alliances with migrants, sex workers, and queer activists. At the same time, we discovered Sophie. She was deeply engaged across Europe, and our circle followed her intervention, especially on Twitter, with growing interest. Then, in 2019, Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, published by Verso, came out, offering us a text through which to think with and alongside these new anti-racist, anti-nationalist, and anti-essentialist feminist movements. These were also years when, especially in radically Marxist circles, accelerationism was being discussed, so the idea that if we push through technological transformations to the limit, we could arrive at an anti-work society based on redistributing resources. But Sophie turned really these hypotheses upside down, asking, what if we apply the same logic to the structures of family and of gestational labor? The idea that full surrogacy could function as a mechanism to abolish the biological reproduction of kinship really blew our minds. As a context, I want to emphasize that in Italy, still today, queer families and single women are still denied to access assisted reproductive technologies and gestational procedures. So everything is legislated under the framework of heteronormative state-certified families. So Sophie's arguments on kinship and gestation struck an even deeper chord in our discussion. Also, at Duke University, where I worked closely with Professor Katy Weeks, that is one of my advisors and mentors, we have been reading Sophie's work consistently in our gender, sexuality, and feminist studies courses. And in just a few weeks, my undergraduate students will engage with full surrogacy now to understand why gestation must be considered a form of labor and how we might disrupt the norms that structure the family system. I don't know exactly when Sophie moves to the US, but it is evident that Black feminist thought and the racial injustices shaping American life deeply influenced her work. This is particularly clear in her second book, Abolish the Family, a Manifesto for Care and Liberation, published again by Verso in 2022, where alternative kinship structures drawn from Black feminist traditions are brought into conversation with anti-work and post-family visions. The book asks us to imagine a world free from the neoliberal work ethic and the fascist construct of the family, a world where care is collective and not tied to the mandates of reproduction or capital. Today, however, we are here to discuss Sophie's latest work, Enemy Feminisms, TERF, Policewomen and Girl Bosses Against Liberation, that has just been published by Haymarket Books, and that we all have to buy later while we are going to the exit. This book helped me articulate why certain forms of radical feminism, those that are exclusionary, purist, and obsessed with policing the boundaries of womanhood, have always felt politically suspect and uncomfortable to me. Enemy Feminisms meticulously reconstruct the genealogy of feminists who have been complicit with power, feminists who aligned with white supremacy, class privilege, the policing of sexuality, and gender essentialism. This is a really urgent intervention, yeah, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today. Enemy Feminism is not a book that seeks reconciliation. It does not offer an easy narrative of progress, nor does it allow its readers the comfort of believing that feminism, by definition, must be a force for liberation. Instead, it forces us to confront feminism's historical complicities, its reactionary tendencies, and even its betrayals. This book is structured around a series of figures: white supremacist feminists, prohibitionist feminists, nationalist feminists, carceral feminists, and many others, who rather than fighting oppression have used feminism to reinforce it. This genealogy is politically urgent, especially now as reactionary forces attempt to, and I quote, restore the biological truth of sex through legislative measures aimed at policing trans lives and everyone's lives. Lewis' critique of trans-exclusionary radical feminists who weaponize gender essentialism to reinforce state violence is especially relevant in a time when alliances between feminists and the right-wing actors are becoming increasingly common. She reminds us that every time feminism neglects to be anti-racist, anti-neoliberal, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, and anti-essentialist, it risks becoming an ally of power. We have many examples in this book, from the suffragists who fought for white women enfranchisement while opposing black voting rights to today femo-nationalists who justify Palestinian genocide using feminist arguments. Enemy Feminisms map out feminism's failures, not as accidental missteps, but as structured tendencies within feminist history. The task Lewis set before us is to confront these histories, to acknowledge how deeply feminism has been shaped by systems of oppression, and to forge a trans and abolitionist feminism that refuses complicity. I really have much to say about this book, about really sharp writing and its engagement with contemporary events, but also its micro-histories of complicit feminist figures and even pop culture analysis. But yeah, we are here mostly to hear from the author. So let me begin with the first question and give back the floor to Sophie. Especially chapter 7 of your book is dedicated to the policewoman, a figure who represents feminism's long-standing investment in carceral power. You analyze how feminist demands for justice have often resulted in the expansion of policing, surveillance, and incarceration rather than structural transformations that address harm. You describe how police women, and I quote, function as glamorous avatars of the thin blue line, end quote, reinforcing the myth that increasingly female representation within the police somehow transforms the institution itself. One of the most compelling examples you analyze is Mayor of Easttown, where Kate Winslet, is a TV show, where Kate Winslet is celebrated not despite, but because of her abuses of power. She even plants drugs in the car of a mother who is also a sex worker to justify taking her child away. Yet she is framed as a feminist icon, her moral complexity is seen as a proof of the show's realism. You argue that this is emblematic of how feminism's entanglement with carceral power is normalized in popular culture. You also challenge the belief that women police officers bring a fundamentally different approach to law enforcement, pointing out that, and I quote again, a cop feminist may even understand on some level that the prison industrial complex is a vast support system for white capitalist patriarchy, and yet nevertheless believe that female police officers don't serve the interest of class power in quite the same way male cops do, end quote. This belief that representation within violent institutions somehow mitigates their harm is a cornerstone of mainstream feminist discourse today, from demands from more female politicians to celebration of women in the military. You challenge many of these narratives that celebrate female CEOs, police chiefs, military leaders, as if they are all symbols of progress. Instead of seeking inclusion in existing power, you call for a feminism that dismantles them altogether. So if we reject the policewoman as a feminist figure, what does that mean for feminism's relationship to the state? How do we push feminist movements away from their reliance on punitive measures and toward the true abolitionist frameworks? And what does justice look like in a world where policing is no longer the default feminist response to harm? Thank you.
Wow, that was rather amazing. But yes, quite big questions, and about 5 of them. You know, I was listening to you, and it's such a treat to have such a deep, sharp engagement, especially one that goes back to pre-full surrogacy now kind of days. I'm grateful. I also was hearing something which I don't think even I escape in the book. In your grammar, I've become extremely attentive and attuned to it, which is this way that when we talk about feminist evil, I suppose, we use grammar of linking. You know, it's complicit in, it's an ally of, it's in bed with, it's, co-opted into. There's about a million of these. And I am actually, even if I don't pull it off all the time, trying very much with this book fundamentally to do something to see what happens if we say sort of something grammatically different, like this is not just allied with racism, this is a racism, right? My student actually said that in the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research course I did on femo-nationalism. She said, actually we're talking about times when feminism was racism, right? Because the core definitions are not ones where you can somehow, take out racial or class factors, There's a sense in which we're so deeply trained epistemically to put women outside of responsibility for history that it just kind of, it's invisible to us, I think, sometimes, the ways in which we do it, and so, especially if feminism means something, emancipatory, it's so deeply counterintuitive to imagine it as echt feminism and also part of empire or capital accumulation or carceral sort of state consolidation. And yet, right? And we've had this long conversation about white feminism in 2021. This really sort of happened, and I really am not pitting myself against that. A lot of the scholarship was fantastic, but I do think that the conversation was somehow allowed by the media, or forced by the media rather, to become something a little bit consolatory, where you apologize and you talk about enlarging the tent, and you keep very much feminism as the good object that we can maintain our attachment to. But of course, if something is inherently anti-liberatory, you don't want to enlarge its tent, do you? That sounds like a terrible idea. And so this is also an attempt to say that our way of thinking feminism has been hampered. Our anti-fascism has been hampered by our confusion and our pain, right, about this reality that actually things that have advanced women's freedom have sometimes been part of the making of unfreedoms on a planetary scale. So it's also looking at how deeply strange the concept that it is a coherent and yet deeply also incoherent category, right? Like we have it, we inherit it, I think we're stuck with it, it means something. Notwithstanding the fact that so many people have taken different names for themselves: womanism, women's liberationism, mujerismo, or there are a proliferation of different words for the project because of how badly people have lived in what I kind of call, in this metaphor, like the house of feminism. And yet, it is something we contend with. And its two Western parents, in a sense, had completely different definitions of what it is. If we take Wollstonecraft, she says that you basically make mother authoritative, rational, and therefore in proprietary ownership over the children in a household, and therefore the future of the nation, and therefore the destiny of empire. The guy who invented the word feminism, on the other hand, thought that, it seems that Charles Fourier invented the word feminism. He actually says the exact opposite about what feminism is, that it's the insurgency of children and women against the private nuclear household. It's no secret which side of that I fall on, right? But it's a neglected counter-thesis. And by the way, this isn't about romanticizing the Fourierist side. That's also a colonialist ideology, as it happens, right? But it is an interesting little story to get us thinking clearly about the way that feminism is not merely full of distinctions and differences, but literally is capacious enough to contain within itself its own enemies, its own antitheses, right? Because gender is so contradictory as a concept that you can build things sincerely on top of it that will be enemies of each other, literally fighting for opposite things, and still meaningfully feminist. So to answer your question as best I can about the policewoman, which I do think is a really good way in, particularly because I'm in the strange position right now of wishing that the cop feminists had won the last United States election, right? And she was a very interesting, Kamala Harris was a very interesting figure to place in this lineage of women's policing, especially because of the riddle of that ideology's invention by radical suffragettes in the UK who made a very short step from bombing the shit out of everything for women's rights, for votes for women in the WSPU. By the way, I imagine most people here were not taught that the WSPU, Mrs. Pankhurst's paramilitary, bombed things. I was taught that they broke a few windows, right? And there's, I'm not saying that bombing things is inherently bad, but I do think it's interesting that an organization that was so authoritarian and which lurched so dramatically to the right on the outbreak of World War I is not talked about more as one that detonated as many nitroglycerin bombs between 1909 and 1913 as the IRA did in 1939, which I'm not against the IRA, just to be clear, right? This is, but you know, it's an interesting kind of element of liberal feminism's legacy bequeathed to us, regardless of our politics, right? And what do we make of our liberal historiography's blindness, inability to think the intertwinement of liberalism and fascism, which you can see play out very directly in the way that women's policing comes out of the minds and practices of former terrorists, right? I mean, you know, I don't think terrorist is a category we can really use on the left, but I just used it, I suppose, right? Mary Sophia Allen, one of the figures in the Pankhurst bombing campaign, made this step into women's policing, and the idea is that, I mean, there's a million things you can say about it, but a sort of muscular, racially superior, uniformed, eugenically inspiring kind of lesbian figure. Lesbian is an interesting element of this story because it's purer as a maternalism, because untouched by marriage and men in its, but it can be very sort of obscene and vulgar in the aristocratic sense in private, even as it enforces extremely strict morality on the working class and sex working and racially othered sort of recipients of this patrician cop feminism. But this figure I look at in an essay, if you're interested, called Lipstick on the Pigs in The Drift, where I go deeper into it, which is also the subject of the policewoman chapter. Mary Sophia Allen, suffragette terror coordinator, turned literal bestie of Adolf Hitler and pioneer of the notion of women's policing. And so how is it that we have this legacy of how women in uniform as an armed wing of the state are going to uplift with suffrage, with sexual hygiene education, with a physical presence in the streets, the world's fairer sex, I suppose, that it is something that comes out of literal fascism, card-carrying, Mussolini-adoring, British Union of Fascists adhering feminism, that it becomes something that only in this country liberals cheer for, as far as I'm really aware. There is some interesting things we might explore about how that now is again breaking down, but in my experience, it is not the MAGA Republican side of this country that chants more women cops, right, as a counter-revolutionary retort to the call from the streets to abolish the police. In fact, it is, the more sort of liberal feminist side of things that values the women's touch in policing and picks up the legacy of this very colonial vision of social work, really, this vision of the woman in uniform, who in the Mayor of Easttown TV show is, explicitly depicted as a dirty cop framing a sex worker to take her child away in a very long and rich tradition of cop feminists, as I call them, doing that because it's for their own good. You know, and I actually end the book with a dialogue between the sex worker liberationist Carol Lee, who is talking with an old friend of hers who was a sex worker with her, right? And who is now working with the police in a program in prisons to ensure that sex workers get put in prison for longer, right? Longer to enable them to come off drugs and sort of experience the life away from the streets that even Catherine McKinnon in one essay suggests is perhaps beneficial, right? Prison time is actually, she thinks, beneficial to the life of the pimps as she imagines it, right? And Carol is literally sitting down with her feminist sister, the former sex worker turned cop, and holding out for this possibility of a union, as she puts it, between the good girls and the whores. And I suppose I linger really on this scene because it is extraordinary. Like this former friend of Carol's looks her in the eyes and says, you know, if you make it easier for women to fall into prostitution, you will have blood on your hands. You know, and Carol Lee is like, blood on my hands. You know, and it's this moving attempt to hold on to a vision of sisterhood, which I actually am, with huge love and respect for Carol Lee, saying is mistaken, is like an anti-fascist strategic mistake. And I'll leave it there for now so that we can talk about other things. But yeah, we can't. I mean, okay, I haven't answered all your questions about how we do justice anti-carcerally, right? But I think we know, in a sense, my book is not constantly giving you equal time to the liberatory antidote, right? This was probably what a certain kind of book for the publishing industry would have had to do to make sure it doesn't sort of seem like a bummer. I am not worried that this book is, as it were, a bummer. I do not think it's a depressing text. I'm pretty confident about that. I think we have to, you know, this is part of the process of utopian possibility making or ground clearing or, you know, world opening. You have to have a moment of negation in utopianism. My previous books, Full Surrogacy Now and Abolish the Family, make it quite clear, I think, what feminism can be. It can be the communization of care, and it has been that, right? In order to sort of bring space back for the eros of that, for the sort of ability for us en masse and collectively to feel that, sense that, espouse that, I think it's also helpful, you know, to point out what historically has been feminism too, and how it has involved not simply difficult moments of unsisterliness, but of literal, mortal antagonism, right? Fighting for actually entirely different things, right? And this does include, yes, a whole world of anti-fascist undercommons in feminism that have been showing us how you do non-carceral, reparative or transformative, community rooted, grassroots, anti-state approaches to sexual violence, to justice, to safety. And in a sense, my book doesn't really, and I'm not going to try now to really answer that more than I'm doing so in this moment, because it's also okay, I think, to say, feminism lives. It's actually everywhere. There's a high left literary opinion that's very prevalent in this moment that says that feminism right now sucks. And I couldn't disagree more, actually. I think feminism is in a kind of, golden age, where all the sorts of abolitionist visions that we need are here. They're here, So I think it's about finding the people near us who have been doing that work And perhaps for some of us that involves a kind of retraining of our gaze, like what we see as feminism, you know. But it's it's here, it's there, it's doing it.
Thank you, Sophie. And definitely reading all the three books, one can sense that we move from the actual proposal and even the manifesto genre that you use in the second book toward really a deep research and analysis on how those figures of evil feminists, to use one of your words, are built in history and at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and how we are bringing these histories with us today. So I want to move to questions that are related to nationalism. You show how many feminisms, particularly Western feminisms, are nationalisms. Many figures have justified border militarization and Islamophobic policies in the name of women's rights. You expose how, and I cite, feminist Zionism has cheered the elimination via starvation or bombs of millions of people from the Gaza Strip, end of quote, weaponizing narratives of gender violence to justify Israeli military aggression. This, you argue, is a part of a longer history in which feminism has served colonial and imperial projects, whether through early suffragist alignment with white supremacy or contemporary liberal feminists complicit in nationalist violence. You critique how feminist rhetoric is mobilized to raise the material conditions of occupation and genocide. For instance, you analyze the aftermath of October 7, 2023, when, and I cite, Zionist feminists sprang into action, attempting to distract from the accelerated genocide of reprisal by amplifying the gender violence claim against Hamas. This phenomenon, you suggest, is part of a broader imperial feminist tendency to use the language of women's rights as a justification for war, much like the US military did in Afghanistan during the pretense of saving Muslim women. We see that logic widely applied today, and it's used really also as a weapon, especially in higher education, in colleges and in the universities that are heavily under attack, especially for encampments against the genocide and in defense of Palestine. So we see this logic, which is a logic that constantly justify imperial interventions abroad, brought back again. As you argue, genocide is sometimes feminist, using this reversal of grammar that you offered in your first response. And not because feminism is inherently violent, but because certain feminists have actively participated in legitimizing imperial violence. So I realize that all my questions are looking to solutions and alternatives. So how do we dismantle all of that? How do we promote a transnational feminism? But mostly, how can we retrace this genealogy of a feminism that is also nationalist? You, for example, mentioned the experience of the safari built the original experience of nationalism and racism.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so many surprising histories here. But for me, it was quite, it's quite pleasurable in a sort of perverse way, although I am looking forward to disagreeing with my comrades rather than looking at enemies. I did actually have a perverse fascination with many of the histories that were more on the nose, than I maybe even anticipated. The historian Linda Gordon has this phrase, and posit, KKK feminism. And I think, like most people, much as I respect her very, very much, right? One of the, in fact, pioneers of family abolitionist rhetoric and thought.
wonderful historian. I still was like, I don't think so, really, But you read Linda Gordon herself, and you read archival materials, and you realize, shit, that's really not it's not an overstatement. KKK feminism, for example, right? Truly one of the elements of this country's feminist lineage. It somehow doesn't make it onto most of the feminist listicles, but the only religious group that supported the radical wing of feminism in 1923, Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment, when it was first tabled, was the Church of the Clan theologian, the first woman ordained a bishop in this country, Alma White, who was basically one of the reasons why the second coming of the KKK, as it is called, happened in the first place here. Radical sort of feminist personage, very much mocked in the press for being a sort of Cromwell in skirts, who sort of ate men, for breakfast. So these visions of sort of national feminism, purging the land of undesirables. In the KKK's case, that's Catholics, obviously blacks, Jews, and a whole host of other figures, especially when they intersect. Nothing like communist foreigners and so on. But going further back, that if you were a feminist young woman in the 1890s in this country, one of the people you'd be maybe crushing on, have posters of, go and attend lectures that would, to hear and really kind of quell over would be this May French Sheldon individual who set out to be the Lady Stanley, to do what the male imperial adventurers in darkest Africa had done, except in a fabulous dress, and to show that it would be possible to do it with way less bloodshed if you did it as a woman dressed like Britannia. She came from Texas originally. She packed a whole bunch of fantastic kind of jeweled clothing to present herself as the White Queen to the people in Kenya and Tanzania who carried all of her stuff, including her palanquin, a great distance, so that she could bring back knowledge to the Royal Geographical Society and other sort of ethnographic and scientific organizations who did, in fact, totally accept her as a valid producer of knowledge, right, about the not just the nature of Africa, but the right methods of colonizing in a sustainable way that could also involve more. She was a figure in really bringing capitalism into the norms and dynamics of empire at the late 19th century. So she, it's just incredible, really, because when you look at some of the pictures, you're like, oh, that's Daenerys Targaryen, I couldn't stop seeing the parallels, because Daenerys in Game of Thrones is talked about as voyaging solo, liberating the people of wherever the hell she goes. And that was what they said about May French Sheldon, who literally hired 150 porters and was reported in the press as traveling alone and unescorted, right? Anyway, you're asking about nationalism. So this is, a really kind of rich rubric for me, because I think part of what I'm trying to do as well when I move towards trans-exclusionary feminist thought at the end of the book, this being, I think, one of the main, along with Zionist feminism, iterations of the enemy feminism we face in the streets today. I'm talking about sexual nationalism as well, like not just the way that this enemy feminism often gets folded into, nationalism, but also the way in which many of the ontological orientations around womanhood could be, can be, should be described as nationalistic in structure in and of themselves. You know, there's a line that Sarah Franklin floated quite a few years ago at this point, which is that TERFs are feminism's Brexiteers, right? She kind of remains at the level of the linking and the analogy, you know, like that metaphor notwithstanding, what she actually says is like, oh, it's like Brexit. But actually, the theorist Alexander Stoffel goes further and says, no, this is a sort of nationalistic, a nationalism of sex, whose structures, he uses sort of Marxist state theory to talk about this. I think there's a battery issue with this. It keeps turning itself off. Okay. Oh, thank you. Ooh. Thank you. Thanks, Tania. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. So there is a structural way in which trans-exclusionary feminist thought is oriented, Stoffel argues, I think it's right, towards a kind of nationalist resolution. Their salvation, their victory will come when they are sort of absorbed into the nation state. And it's really interesting to think about this, the way that what Emma Heaney would call a feminism against cisness, again, which is a category she means in racializing, class determined, colonial sorts of ways, going back several centuries, not sort of new, not cisness is not simply the thing that, trans people who, as we know, people love to pretend are recent phenomena in human history, that they invent the category cisness. We need to provincialize cisness, and understand it as the thing that many feminisms are actually unmaking, only to provoke an internal feminist, in a sense, counter-revolution, which is then nationalistically re-establishing womanhood in this ontological definition with strong borders, strong national sort of sexual borders, to then push back down. There's a motion in feminism of movement against cisness, followed by a kind of backlash and a kind of re-entrenchment of ontological or nationalist or cis feminist consolidation. So yeah, nationalism is right through this book in a sense because I'm interested in how revolutionary feminism is supplanted by female cultural nationalism, but I'm also literally, telling stories all the time about, this Jewish supremacist vision, copying the Anglo-Saxon feminists' narratives about how feminism is actually a racial destiny. In a sense, Mary Wollstonecraft gave us that. I don't call her an enemy feminist, but she supplied many of the tools and frameworks, right? The Langham Place group in the UK invented, in a sense, one of the first feminist brands, this idea of Miss Jane Bull, who is the daughter of John Bull and his wife. It's a bit like Uncle Sam, except for Britain, and it's a brilliant marketing strategy. It turns out Mr. Bull and his wife have a feminist daughter, Jane, who is a perfect avatar of the the Anglo-Saxon race's inherent, guess what, primordial destiny of gender equality. She's a can-do, no-nonsense English rose who's going to go off and clean up the colonies and eugenically uplift all that hold her through her, her very sort of biological composition. It's such a fantastic kind of move, empire is not going to be messed with by feminism, gentlemen. It's actually, on the contrary, going to be saved by feminism. Because the deep Anglo-Saxon past is feminist, actually, right? And this is the sort of one of the origin points of this move we see again and again and again today, where feminism becomes a technology of xenophobic statecraft. It's actually, femo-nationalism is the name for this, right? That it is the, unenlightened, Oriental as opposed to Occidental kind of world that has misogyny, that has patriarchy, and it becomes a duty of the European, the EU, for instance, state to educate the migrant and absorb them into differentially a regular reserve army of labor and a regular army of labor and a reserve based on whether they're men or women, the women being, good for care labor and service industries in the country, whereas the men can be educated by them to be, non-terroristic, sort of docile citizen subjects. And this is why you get these like patronizing kind of welcome to the Netherlands pacts that explain that, women are people here and so on and that, but yeah, in France right now and in French-speaking Switzerland, there's this group Nemesis, which is feministe identitaire, identitarian feminists of the extreme right, as they describe themselves, and they are, hyper nationalist in probably the most extreme iteration of this. It's an old flavor, right? But they demonstrate against all migration into France. I mean, Marine Le Pen and also the women's liberation stalwart Alice Schwarzer in Germany have been saying these kinds of things, that actually France and Germany would have no problems with street harassment and sexual violence if it weren't for immigration, and so Germany became a feminist nation overnight after the Cologne incident, the way it was mediatized, a sort of supposed mass systematic, where we heard these words lately, right? Sexual violence sort of spree on New Year's Eve 2015, after which suddenly the state got with the program of certain long-standing feminist demands around rape-related legislation, and acceded to many long-standing feminist policy demands because it was suddenly a racial weapon that became, prudential to use or something, for certain aspiring politicians of the far right. So anyway, I'm rambling, but I think this is, clearly also the good news is maybe crumbling or exposing itself or straining at the very least its plausibility on the national stage. I think the extent to which, the world was confronted with the spectacle of, people like Benjamin Netanyahu posing as feminists, scolding the world's feminist organizations for not getting behind the genocide of Palestinians in the name of rape revenge, is perhaps also having a radicalizing kind of effect, given that anti-Zionist feminism is mushrooming and efflorescing everywhere. Zionist feminism has a very similar history, as I said, to the Anglo-Saxon version. So, this was part of a strategy of entry into whiteness via colonizing, for early Zionist Jewish women who said the same stuff about their ethnic, biologized past. It was actually very gender equal, and this would be turned to, in the promised land, where men and women built the startup nation side by side together, as they say in the pages of the Jerusalem Post all the time. In fact, it was argued after October 7th in the Jerusalem Post that Hamas is now completely debunked, really debunked crimes of sexual violence on October 7th were perpetrated because they were opposed to the legacy of Simone de Beauvoir. There was actually a piece arguing this. It was called the anti-Zionist sex or something like this. And it was saying, that Israel really represents like women's rights in the region, and that Hamas is doing what it did when it, broke out of jail on October 7th, because it specifically had a sort of anti-feminist animus and agenda. Extraordinary scenes, really. And I think that the hopeful thing is provocative of new and courageous insights, if not directly from Palestinian feminists, powerful and decades-long analysis of reproductive genocide, as they call it, and the gender dynamics of settler colonialism, then simply by the sort of unholy and ongoing spectacle of the reproductive genocide itself, right? Which just re-accelerated. But who knows? Feminism has to be, I think, anti-nationalist, and the internationalist feminism against cisness that I long for, and that is not completely non-existent, is also discernible, where we choose to look. If we train our attention in the right places, rather than sort of wringing our hands over the obvious enemy manifestations, which I do also think it's important to clarify and get, stop being confused about, in a sense. Anyway, thank you, Tania.
Thank you, Sophie. How are you all doing? Okay? We have 2 more questions to go, and I highly recommend reading the chapter The Civilizer, which really compares the story of the safari in Africa with Game of Thrones, and it's really amazing, and it's also beautifully written. Sophie really brings the reader into those spaces and those histories, reviving them. And I'm realizing now while talking that we basically subdivided this discussion into 4 pieces, and we discussed about the state and the role of the police. We discussed now about nation, but I want you to speak a little bit more in detail about the relationship between gender and sexuality, and even if you mentioned that already, what is the genesis also of the trans-exclusionary radical feminism, because you recount the story of the moral panic around sexuality, especially during the sex wars, and how sexually active children, you say, experimental masturbators, same-age lovers, or juvenile sex workers, for example, were really pathologized as deviant in need of rescue via punishment, and systematically institutionalized in insane asylums. So now, today, the same prohibitionist logic is used to justify crackdowns on sex work, border control policies, and also the criminalization of gender-affirming care. Feminists who align with these reactionary movements, you argue, are not simply misguided, they are upholding state violence. And so this is the case, for example, of trans-exclusionary radical feminists who align themselves with the far right, leveraging feminist language to advance anti-trans policies that reinforce state control. But now, the stakes seem pretty high now that also this state in the United States embraced the vision of trans-exclusionary radical feminism. And so how also to reaffirm the emancipatory approach to gender and sexuality in the face of this mounting backlash.
Yes, so the sex wars of the 80s recapitulate in surprisingly numerous ways in a sense, what we could call the first sex wars, the first waves sex wars, actually, where what initially began as a flawed but pro-sex worker and, with sex workers participating in kind of movement against the state as pimp, got taken over and swamped by feminists who wanted to stamp out all deviant sexuality, meaning to them extramarital. To be honest, it's hard to see what kind of sexuality they didn't want to stamp out, actually. As your quote about the way that one of the effects of this wave of 1910s, 1920s feminist success, and it is actually celebrated unapologetically as success by figures like Sheila Jeffreys, the political lesbian radical and arch TERF. They got loads of young girls incarcerated in insane asylums for masturbating, basically. And this was under the aegis of a sort of white slavery panic. Basically, I think historians are agreed, almost entirely fictional sort of epidemic of abduction and enslavement of young girls by racialized others, sometimes Jewish, sometimes migrant, initially also aristocratic rakes. Depraved aristocrats were part of the story. It then became very malleable. So white slavery, so-called white slavery, could become elastically expanded to refer to almost anything at all, really, or it could be shrunk, depending on the context. But this, I think you're right to bring in a question about sexuality and a question that's also about the trans-exclusionary international and its radical feminist branch. Do you remember how shocked people were a couple of years ago when Judith Butler talked about trans-exclusionary radical feminism as related to, I think their formulation was quite circumspect, but they related it to fascism. And The Guardian was so pressured, and internally pressured too, by the freak out against this, that it took down this part of the interview with Butler by Jules Joanne Gleason, in which this kind of analysis was aired. And yet, look where we are now, right? Many of the UK's big pundits of radical feminist trans annihilationism, J.K. Rowling calls herself a radical feminist, have no problem celebrating the victories as they see it on only these issues of the fascist administration currently taking over, right? So the way that they might put this is, well, of course, I remain not a far right kind of person. I'm totally a liberal or leftist. I'm a radical feminist, which means leftist in some official way. I'm arguing, no, it doesn't. But it is in fact the left that has abandoned feminism, the left that has abandoned women, leaving, as it were, feminism on the floor for MAGA to pick up. And so it is not I, J.K. Rowling, who has become MAGA aligned. It is the left that has abandoned feminism. I stay with feminism. Donald Trump's executive order, quote unquote, defending women against gender ideology extremism is a fantastic victory for women and girls, right? They have no problem saying this. Some of the other big figures of so-called gender critical or sex-based rights, as they call it, activism, were even more forthcoming with their celebration of the mushrooming of anti-trans policy making in this country right now, right? And it is about also, yes, sexuality, and it is also connected to an attempt to push the labor of life-making back into the private nuclear household, back into the supposedly safe, from sexual danger, stranger danger, which is not where most sexual danger comes from. As we know, feminists used to say that a lot. I feel like feminism doesn't say that so much anymore. The headquarters of most forms of violence in this world is actually, the family and its close cousins. Fine. These are sorts of, perfect avatars, these sorts of thoughts that Rowling and her ilk express about what women are, what women need, and so on, are perfect, echoes, in a sense, of these counter-revolutionary feminist moments through the first wave and second wave sex wars about fear of a moment of sexual efflorescence that is also a moment of utopian foolishness or uncertainty about what we collectively are and might become. This is the sort of anti-nationalist, if you want to use that metaphor, if you're comfortable with it, kind of sort of drive or direction or eros in liberatory feminism, where when the universe starts to crack open, and impossible things become thinkable, like abolition of the family, what Kathy Weeks calls the infamous demand of the feminists in 1970 at their peak, right? At the peak of feminist power, this was what became sayable and thinkable. There's also a deep kind of unmooring in. There is courage to become less certain about what kinds of animals we even have to necessarily continue to be in the future, right? And the feminism of certainty, of deadly ontological certainty, and bordering, and moat building, and fortressing, and of anti-sex because, it's too dangerous. This is the sort of enemy feminism that comes in to restore, in a sense, order, right? It is destabilizing to not know necessarily anymore what woman is, and to not have innocence as one of the affordances of woman as political constituency. So even the some of the revivals of, I don't know, Andrea Dworkin and so on today going on, even when they say they are pro-trans, I really think you can structurally see a sort of response to trans feminist advances in this revival. I mean, they throw around this goddamn article about how Andrea Dworkin was a trans ally by Dworkin's life partner. It's an article whose evidence for this is just that it's basically like, trust me, bro. It's also like she wrote something in 1972 that was pro-trans, and okay, she wrote a lot of things in 1972 that she then recanted. Whatever. I'm not trying to pin her down either way. My point is that I think you can say more structurally, there is a sort of desire for a return to a sense of feminism that has women as innocence, as historical innocence. Dworkin says women have not really entered history at all. They are not responsible for history. And this is just, I think, completely wrong. And actually, I would say epistemically anti-feminist, right? Like, and this is kind of where we were at the very beginning of this conversation. I think these moves to say, oh, feminism, has been weaponized by, instrumentalized by, co-opted by, complicit in, and so on and so forth, doesn't actually give feminism the respect it deserves as a historic force, powerful enough to have blood on its hands.
Thank you, Sophie, and also recounting the story of trans exclusionary radical feminists here. It's not only a history of evil, but at this point, with their alignment to make America MAGA again, it's also super sad for them. So it's also a quasi-feminism without any joy. You also write that racism is a patriarchal form of feminism, and this is really, again, one of your grammatical interventions that forces us to reconsider feminism's long history with white supremacy. You trace how white feminists have not only made alliances with racist structure, but have actively shaped them, leveraging the language of women's rights to justify colonial violence, anti-black racism, and nationalist exclusion. You said already something, for example, with the story of Alice Schwarzer. There is much to say because this is happening all over Europe, even at times the president, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, is considered to be a feminist, especially when she started the divorce with her ex-husband because he was found to sexually harass someone on television, but he was also recorded. So that was the scene. And really, Giorgia Meloni is positioning herself as a strong promoter of trans-exclusionary radical feminism, but also of what she calls the anti-gender ideology. There is a gender ideology we have to contrast, she says, and this perfectly aligns also with their policy of migration and policing the borders, which that has enormous consequences, especially on the Mediterranean Sea, since many migrants are drawing there. Your book details how in different historical moments white feminists have chosen to prioritize racial solidarity over gender solidarity. So, we have many examples. What I'm interested here in discussing is that at the same time you highlight how certain feminist movements have positioned themselves explicitly against anti-racism. You recount also this story, especially in the chapter on anti-racist abolitionists that show how some feminists fought against slavery while refusing to challenge white supremacy. And this contradiction shaped profoundly the history and also the present of the United States. So here really we see how important it is to put in practice abolitionist feminism, and this abolition must entail not only contrasting the state, but also all the dynamics of white supremacism. Do you want to tell us the story of these feminist movements that positions themselves against anti-racism? And this is my last question.
I think, yeah, I'll speak to it, and I think if people still have a little stamina and have some questions, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
I think we were supposed to wrap up after an hour, and it's been over an hour.
Cool.
Yeah, but yeah, this part of the story is much told, although I think often not told quite well enough, right? The New York Times and everybody under the sun in the liberal cultural milieu has been up for recounting the sins of the suffrage for mothers where white supremacy is concerned. But it's a very tightly controlled conversation. And the upshot is, to make sure we can, in fact, keep figures like Susan B. Anthony and so on, obviously as part of feminism. We're not going to exclude Susan B. Anthony from feminism because she was very much a committed white supremacist. This is somehow a thought that this is an insistence. This is, in fact, I think sometimes the main priority of the conversation. Like, how can we, as good liberals, simultaneously insist that feminism must be anti-racist and keep Susan B. Anthony? This seems to be the important question. And I get it. I actually get why it's painful. I mean, and of course, another way of thinking about this book is that I'm working on one level, a taxonomical question. Now, it's not the most important question in the book. I think this is a book about how we contend with enmity within kinship, in a sense, how we think about mutant kin as enemies, and how that practice helps us hold on to one another better actually, and render one another less disposable, because we are dedicated to the anti-fascist practice of collectively drawing lines that we've all agreed on and then holding them, But there is a taxonomical question too, which is like, okay, I get why we love to say X, Y, and Z aren't real feminisms. Feminists aren't real feminists. This is in fact what anti-fascists have said in the streets to the Nemesis collective that I mentioned, the ones that are rabidly Islamophobic and self-described radical feminists at the same time. The anti-fascist placard that I saw online says, Nemesis, vous ne serez jamais féministes. You'll never be feminists, because of your Islamophobia. I get why we say these kinds of things. We're saying, in a sense, it's a valuable form of solidarity sometimes to say this, because what we're really saying is like, you're not our people, the people you're targeting, we have your backs, this kind of thing, right? And everyone remembers the whole, like, our feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit kind of, feminism must be X, Y, and Z or it is not feminism. This is what we say. I've never quite been satisfied with it, right? And I suppose you can slice it one way. You can say, sure, feminism must be anti-racist, anti-ableist, socialist, whatever you want, or it is not feminist. But in that case, you can't have Mary Wollstonecraft, you can't have Susan B. Anthony, and you can't have a bunch of people. You can't have, in fact, the whole canon, okay? Pretty much. So if you want to do that, we can do that. I think it's way less rational than the much more difficult staying with the trouble kind of thing I'm trying to do, which is, look, we inherit this shit. It's deep, And I don't think it makes sense to say that, as the New York Times conversation sort of does all the time about these anti-racist abolitionists, as I call them, and their deep commitment to a white supremacist definition of gender, and their espousal of racism as a patriarchal form of feminism. Yes, it's a provocative formulation, especially out of context. I'm talking about, I think that comes from the chapter about, this kind of Smith and Wesson feminism, right? This kind of that's in the Klan chapter where we have, the image of the armed white woman, but in some cases, paradoxically, she cannot be white. Like the Nigerian Antonia Okafor is a Turning Point USA self-described radical feminist pioneer of the Second Amendment right to defend yourself against rape. What is the saying? God made man and woman equal. Smith and Wesson makes sure it stays that way. Right? This is the kind of lynching traditions of feminism. But yeah, fighting against slavery without at all fighting against racism. In fact, fighting very much for racism while fighting for slavery. This is, in a sense, how feminism came into being qua feminism as we know it in this country, and that is not, in fact, what we tend to say, right? We tend to try and very much minimize or historically sort of, relativize the questions, like, the New York Times said that Carrie Chapman Catt made one ill-advised remark or something, and so it's extremely silly that the students at one or other university don't want their building named after Mrs. Catt. This is the sort of approach. I think the more difficult thing is to think about our attachments, our contaminations, our cyborgicity, and also to grieve the unreceived, the erased, the memory hold undercommons of feminism. Because after all, Wollstonecraft was writing in the middle of the Haitian Revolution. Were there not anti-slavery feminisms, maroon feminisms, anti-colonial, proto-communist feminisms in her day, proletarian feminisms in her very household, amongst the servants? Were there not anti-fascist feminisms in Mary Sophia Allen's day? Of course there were. Some of them we know, some of them we see. But in a sense, feminism has been told to us in a deeply, forgetful on purpose kind of way. And so I think there is a grief in this book about what has been hidden from us about feminism's other participants, the undercommons of feminism, as I'm suggesting we could also think about it. And so we might not be able to read them or find them in all cases, but the fact is that we know they were there because the enemy feminists were fighting against somebody. And so we have their ghosts and their traces, and it's our anti-fascist duty to carry their untold legacy forward into the present. Yeah.
Let's have some questions.
Now we are opening up for questions, if there are from the audience.
Do I need the microphone or I can project, or do I need to speak into it?
I don't know if they're recording.
Yeah, I really appreciated your bringing in Shotwell's claiming bad kid. And I think that's something that maybe you're trying to highlight with enemy feminism is we also have to know who our lineages come from. And I was thinking of kind of you talking about J.K. Rowling and this turf and if MAGA agrees with us, it's kind of the left's fault, right? But I think of some of these positions as maybe we try to point out that turf feminism, when it aligns with MAGA or any other feminisms that also align with white supremacy and other things like that, that these are contradictory. You're talking about that these aren't real feminisms. But I guess I see this as a more of an immature analysis on the part of the maybe other feminists or feminisms left feminisms, anti-nationalist feminisms. And I guess what is lost, and maybe you bring this up in the book, but what is lost and what from the side of the left when we don't take these seriously as feminisms, especially when these kinds of feminisms are very allied with power currently. So just thinking what is lost when we don't actually acknowledge our bad kid.
Yeah. Should we take?
Yep.
Or other older? Okay.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it's a really great question. Yeah, great question. Really great question. I think what is lost is, among other things, an ability to I think what happens when we make these purgative gestures, it's not as good as the kind of collective, iterative, contingent line drawing that I think anti-fascism need. We do have to hold lines. This is kind of crucial, but it's contingent. It's not given in advance. And when we make these kind of refuse to recognize, refuse to claim any kind of involvement or kinship with things we see that are being done in a sense in our names, and that horrify us, we're missing an opportunity to reflect on the very, dangerous and dizzying intertwinement of political legacies materially, and economically through history, liberalism and fascism particularly. But I think we're also quashing what I guess I've referred to today as the eros of feminism. There's a sort of, by refusing the kinship and the intimacy and the involvement, I think we also sort of hypostatize our position as pure and kind of deny ourselves the real presence that is required for something to have I don't know, a libidinal or an erotic kind of élan, you know? Fascisms have been very good at eroticizing their ontologies, you know? And I think I want to maybe end today by asking, not answering necessarily, but asking us to think about an erotics of anti-fascism that has to do with perhaps the deliciousness of interdependence and bodily mutuality and vulnerability and uncertainty, because that is what we need, I think, in response to things that are connected to us that we would rather were not connected to us, you know, rather than the sort of disavowal gesture, something that gives us the confidence of our ground as well, you know, something that gives us the sort of juice that terrifyingly the fascists have, their jouissance in cruelty, even in genocidal annihilation, right? A feminist politician in the Knesset, I think, made a comment a couple of days ago about how she is proud of the ruins of Gaza because she, in the name of these, you know, sexual violence victims of October 7th and the phantasmatic Zionist narrative and imagination, you know, she's proud of what was done genocidally to avenge Jews and Jewish women, right? And she says that people will talk for thousands of years in the future of what the Jews did in Gaza. And that is a pleasurable subject position that she's occupying there. It's a similar pleasure to the pleasure that people feel when they witness these IDF women soldiers kind of facing down. There are a lot of videos like this of military Israeli combatants who are women bravely facing down Arab men, proud, defiant, and so on. Cisness is actually an interesting analytic here because cisness, as Emma Heaney gives it to us, is something that has always provided the option, the availability of masculine priority to bourgeois white cis women. You don't get transphobically attacked when you're someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene doing a sort of femphobic attack on Jasmine Crockett for her eyelashes, because Marjorie Taylor Greene is positions herself as a CrossFit bro, kind of. But does she suffer transphobia because of that? No, of course not. Neither do, in a sense, do these arguably transmasculine figures in this strange lineage of archetypes, because there has always been the availability of masculine priority for a certain kind of bourgeois white woman, and that is the logic of cisness. That's part of the logic of cisness. Yeah, and I think we need to find some kind of pleasure in an anti-fascist erotics. That's like an really urgent task for us right now.
Thank you. Great.